Hello, and welcome to number 27. As you can see, I have changed my sheet into dark mode. This is something I think a few videos ago someone asked for, and I figured why not try it? If people like it, don't like it, let me know. If people want me to try a different coloring for the actual sheet itself, I'm also open to that. Got no problem with that if that's more convenient for people or more nice for people. I'm a man of the people, so let me know what would be good for you. Anyway, let's get started. Why isn't there a conversion from percent armor pen to lethality for lethality ratios? So I think there's the gameplay and then there's the design. I'm going to talk about the gameplay first, which I could separate into two categories, which are pike and items, right? Those are where our lethality ratios are actually held. So talking about pike first, this one is not super complicated. Basically, we always wanted Pike to be heavily encouraged to interact with squishy champions, right? That was, that's like a lot of the incentives on his kit are designed for that. But if you look at his actual, like if you don't think about his ultimate, at all, right? You don't look at the ultimate, right? And even if you do, right? I'm just saying like it's simpler if you don't. But if you don't look at the ultimate at all and you look at the base kit's actually not that bad at interacting with frontline, right? It's like, oh, I have a dash that turns into a stun. That's going to hit a lot of the, less mobile, tankier, bigger frontline people. I have a hook that has to be charged, but, really tanky people are going to have a harder time punishing you for that. And so the base kit is actually quite good, right? Especially at tankier champions who don't have a lot of burst at interacting with those champions, right? And so when we wanted him to interact with the squishier backline, especially with this Q, which requires him to, if you want to actually hook someone, you have to stand not crazy close, but somewhat close to someone while you charge a spell as a squishy melee champion, right? You're not crazy squishy, but you're not allowed to build health, right? And so you can't scale your durability super efficiently with items. And so in order to encourage him to have the pattern of that we actually wanted of targeting the backline and like actually rewarding him appropriately for interacting with squishier champions, we wanted his damage to be heavily weighted towards interacting with the backline, right? Like the damage on his base kit specifically. Of course, his ultimate is already doing a lot of the things that percent pen is doing, right? His ultimate is better true damage, essentially, right? Because it goes through shields. That scales heavily with lethality, right? And so because of that, uh, we ended up in this situation where we didn't actually want Pike to feel like percent pen was the thing to buy because if we let him buy percent penetration, he actually has much more powerful base kit interactions with frontline, right? And so then the incentives around who he's targeting get changed around, and there's going to be a lot of situations where instead of making the cool flashy play of like going for backline and taking big risks to try and get a big payout, you end up in a situation where it's like, well, actually, you just buy Cyrilda's second, and uh, you just go for you just go for the front line. Instead, you just e through the enemy Braum or whatever. I don't know what's a good example of this. Probably not Braum, but you just e and q the enemy front line, and that's a lot more rewarding than it is on live. Also, do note the Pike was made before Cyrilda's existed, and so most of what Endless Pillows was considering at the time was like like Last Whisper's item structure, which he definitely didn't want to go into. Maybe he would have felt differently if Cyrilda's had existed when he originally made Pike, but I actually think that it makes a lot of sense for him to just scale with lethality because of the targeting incentives around. Look, his ult is already good at killing literally anyone, right? And particularly people who have a lot of armor because it deals it's essentially true damage, right? Again, like I said, essentially better true damage, right? On the ultimate when someone is below the threshold, and so he already has a way of pretty effectively interacting with those champions. If his allies can get them into the execute threshold, and so we didn't want to overly push him towards interacting with frontline, rather than having the cool like the incentive to make the cool play and go for backline and actually have the high risk high reward payout. And so I think for Pike it makes sense for him not to have it. For items, I think it's a combination of things. I think for Axiomark, a lot of what Axiomark has on it is that was originally a way to the lethality ratio on Axiomark was a way to encourage people to not just build it first, which is one of the problems we saw with the version that didn't scale with lethality. For Umbral Glaive and Bastion Breaker, which are items that I just made have lethality ratios in this current season, The reason why I pushed them there was basically there's a build that we don't that is very easy to not see, which is building multiple lethality items. Right. Generally, in the past, what we've found is that assassins tend to gravitate towards builds that are lower risk and often not crazy on fantasy. Right, where they're building like fighter items. Right, like there have been many metas in the past where it's been the most common build for an assassin is something like insert your favorite lethality item. Maybe it's Ghostblade. Maybe it's whatever. Mythic era. Maybe it's like Eclipse or Duskblade or Prowlers or whatever. Right. Insert your favorite lethality item. Percent pen, right? And then just build fighter items afterwards. And to be clear, I'm not saying that can't be a good build. I think it's fine if that build is good for some assassins, and that's a totally real build structure. But we do want building full damage to be viable and a real option. And one of the easiest ways we can encourage that is to encourage stacking lethality, right? Not specifically percent penetration, because the percent pen is of course amazing in every single build, regardless of whether you're going lethality stacking or whether you're going fighter items or GA later on in the game, whatever, right? By encouraging stacking a lot of lethality and having the lethality ratio be quite high, we can encourage builds that look more like, in the current day, something like, Profane Hydra into Axiom Arc, and now building, in theory, building something like an Umbral Glaive or a Bastion Breaker is actually pretty attractive because you have a lot of lethality, right? That build isn't manifesting super hard on live, though I think the champions that do buy Umbral Glaive first actually do feel like building a second lethality item is often going to be more powerful because of that lethality ratio. Like that's just mathematically true. And I think that's actually really good. Basically, the ultimate answer here is that all AD assassin champions are going to buy some form of percent penetration in their full build, right? Whereas they might not buy multiple lethality items. And so by having it be only a lethality ratio, we encourage that specific type of build, which is something that we've seen in the past, is something that is very, very easy to not have in the game, right? Where all AD assassins are trending towards fighter builds. And again, I'm not saying that build can't be good. What I'm saying is that we want the full damage builds to be viable and be good. And so we want the item structure to be able to support those builds in order to make sure that that's a viable option for the people that actually just want to build damage and the most damage in every slot, because no matter what kind of ratios we give the items, the percent pen will always be good, right? Whereas the reality is that lethality might not be good, just given the right meta, the right tuning on items, the right tuning of the champions, et cetera, et cetera. Right? There's a lot of situations that can lead down the road of assassins buying a lot of fighter items, which again can be fine, but we want the full damage builds to be viable and to be good, right? And so that's the more gameplay side of things. I think in regards to the design side of things, generally speaking, simplicity and readability and understandability are values that we have here for a lot of these these types of things. I think especially on the items, right? I think we'd be less concerned with a lot of those things on Pike. Like if we felt like, yeah, we really want percent pen to scale Pike because it's better for his kit incentives. Like it's better for the way that he interacts with the item system. I think we would just do it and not worry too much about it. But I think for the item system, we generally do value that it is easy to understand when an item is good, what an item is doing, why an item is good or bad with other items that you might purchase in the game. All of those things I think we consider to be pretty important, partially because every single champion has to understand what every single item is going to do for them, and therefore I think we do have a not like a crazy level of resistance, but a light resistance to anything that adds really wonky scalings, or anything that makes it really really complicated and like heavily mathy to understand. Hey, how exactly does this thing work on my champion, right? And I think that having a percent pen ratio on like an item in addition to a lethality ratio, I'm not saying we could never do it, right? We absolutely could. It's just we wouldn't do it unless we felt like it was doing something structurally really important for the item system. And I currently think we actually believe that the gameplay, like because of the gameplay is probably a little better, we're not going to add a percent armor pen ratio to something like an Umbral Glaive or a Bastion Breaker or an Axiom Arc, because we actually think that that has a meaningful complexity and readability cost And so, therefore, if the gameplay is even slightly better or neutral without it being there, we're generally going to trend towards not having it if it has a complexity cost, and we believe it's a it's a side grade or light downgrade in terms of incentives and gameplay. And so that's generally how I think we kind of look at these things. Is hey, we obviously have really complicated, items, runes, etc. in the game, but we do that when we believe that the complexity, there's like the juice is sort of worth the squeeze, if that makes sense, right? Like where that complexity is worth it. And I don't think we currently believe that that's true for something like this, where, hey, it would literally be more complicated, right? I think in terms of the global, like the global version of this, right? There's people who are saying, who think things. I think like, oh, well, you could just not even tell the player that this is true and just do it. It's like, well, actually, this is pretty important for build incentives. I don't think we could do this without telling the player, or at least giving them some heads up that this is exactly what's happening, because this does actually affect how you're supposed to build. If you're paying attention to your build and you read your Umbreglaive or your Axiomark or whatever, I think Axiomark's probably the most operative here. The fact that it would literally change what you might want to buy later on in your build, in other item slots, I think it is pretty relevant here, because on Axiomark it's a huge percentage of the power, like the lethality ratio is a large percentage of the power budget of that item, right? And so having sort of an invisible conversion, I think, is pretty off the table here, because it actually like is important. Players understand this if they're building in this system. And so, like I said, I don't think this is something we could never do, but I think in the current game it just makes a lot of sense for us not to do something in this space. What's the counterplay to Mordekaiser ult? So I think there's a couple of things going on here. I'm going to explain a lot here. So first, let's talk about strategy versus tactics, right? Uh, a lot of counterplay in League is tactical, right? Dodge this skill shot, execute this skill check, right? For those of you not familiar, strategy versus tactics is talking about like, hey, strategy is talking about like overarching, like meta strategy of like, how are you going to win the game, right? Or strategy versus tactics applies to more than just games, but just like, how are you going to accomplish your goal in a sort of more general, broad sense of like, how are you approaching doing that thing? And then tactics is about, hey, when you get down to the actual detail level of like in the moment, how are you accomplishing that small, that like small, component of like what leads up to your overarching, strategy of winning the game. What is that, right? And some people would call this like macro versus micro for games, etc. Don't need to get into all this terminology, right? But essentially what I'm getting at is that a lot of Mordekaiser counterplay is about strategy and not tactics, right? And League tends to lean more heavily on tactical counterplay, around like skill shots, etc., especially in comparison to other MOBAs. But Mordekaiser ult is, I think, a good example of one of League's sort of important like skill checks on strategic counterplay, where a lot of the counterplay sometimes is just, yeah, actually, you just weren't supposed to try to 2v1 Mordekaiser, right? You weren't supposed to gank Mordekaiser at level 6 as a level 5 jungler a lot of the time, right? You just aren't supposed to get that close to him, right? He's immobile, right? He doesn't have a movement speed steroid. He doesn't have a dash, right? He often is going to have a hard time enforcing his will upon you, and has, people have to come to him, right? It's a much less extreme version, for example, of someone like Alawi, right? Where Alawi's very bad at going forward and encroaching, enforcing her will upon others, but she's incredibly powerful when you approach her. Mordekaiser Ultimate is just like that, but in a less sharp, less powerful way. And a lot of this, what this comes down to is, hey, actually, as someone who gets completely owned by Mordekaiser Ultimate, if you don't have any counterplay in the moment, you probably aren't supposed to get that close to him. Or if you are getting close to him, you're probably supposed to put yourself in a position where your team can trade you out for the Mordekaiser if he does ult you in that situation, right? Also, there are a lot of champions that have abilities that can neutralize Mordekaiser in when he ults you, right? As an example, if you're Zeri and you're a lot weaker than Mordekaiser 1v1, but you just don't use your E, a lot of the time Mordekaiser is not going to be able to kill you in his ultimate, right? Or you're Janna, you don't want to get Mordekaiser ulted and die. Well, guess what? If you don't use your Q and W, it's going to be really hard for Mordekaiser to kill you in the ultimate, because you'll knock him up and then immediately follow that with a giant slow, and be running away from him at Mach 10, and it'll be very hard for him to kill you. It is the case that there are some champions that that don't have those tools, and for them, the counterplay, a lot of it comes down to strategic counterplay of, hey, don't be in that situation. Don't be in that position where you get ulted by Mordekaiser. Or when you get ulted by Mordekaiser, make sure that it actually ends up being a net negative for Mordekaiser and his, the Mordekaiser's team, because your team trades you out and you're less valuable, or whatever combination of circumstances there is. There is also some tactical counterplay, and I think this might be the first time I've ever done this, but we're going to bring up Paint here. And don't worry, I've also put painted dark mode. But for anyone who's listening to this as audio, by the way, let me know how you feel about this, because I know some people have told me before that they listen to the audio of my videos. But I'm going to bring up Paint here to sort of explain something. So Mordekaiser ult actually has a really interesting property where let's suppose that we have Mordekaiser standing here. I'll do my best to explain this for the audio only people as well, but I think this is really nicely distributed. Or not nicely, just what am I saying? This is really nicely understandable with the paint diagram. So this is Mordekaiser with his giant mace. I don't know why I made it look like that. It's like kind of spiky, I guess. I don't know. Let's put some spikes on it. I think that makes sense. Anyway, so here's Mordekaiser, right? And when he ults someone, right? Like let's suppose he ults this person over here. The way that the ultimate generates is not not the way that I think a lot of people think that it is. So let's suppose this poor sap. I don't know who is this. Okay, let's suppose it's Lee Sin. We're gonna give him a blindfold. All right, so this is Lee Sin. Lee Sin is getting ulted, right? And what ends up happening is that I think a lot of people think that the circle works like this, where it's just sort of evenly distributed, or like there's just a giant circle that you have to play with. That is actually not how Mordekaiser ult works. The way that Mordekaiser ult works is actually that it's like this. The circle is offset. The center of the circle, actually, this isn't even right. I probably need to get more space. The circle is kind of like this. Obviously, that's not a circle, but you kind of get what I'm talking about. The center of the circle is actually behind the person getting ulted, right? It's a very substantially offset circle. And so as the person who's getting ulted, and Mordekaiser has some agency over this too, right? But essentially what determines the center of the ultimate is that if you extend a vector out from the line between Mordekaiser and the person he's ulting, the center of the circle is slightly behind them, right? It's this point that's behind the target, right? And so as the person who is potentially getting ulted, you have some agency in how this how the ultimate is generated, like where in the ultimate you're allowed to run, right? And obviously there's going to be situations where Mordekaiser has Rylai's, he pulls you in and you can't really do anything about generating the circle in the place that you want, right? But there are also a lot of situations where, especially if you're a ranged champion or you have some mobility tools, you can set the circle to kind of give yourself a really powerful escape tool behind you, right? Because remember, you're going to have a lot of room behind you to run. And generally speaking, the size of the circle is timed out so that in the average case, Mordekaiser does get to catch up to you, right? Before the 7-second duration. It is 7 seconds still, right? I think that's right. But before the duration of the ultimate is up, it's kind of timed out such that if you just run backwards, Mordekaiser will likely catch up to you, right? That's intended. The thing is, imagine you create a situation where there's some walls here, right? Like say there's a wall here, or you're in the jungle and there's like a wall here as well. Walking through here actually gives you more space to work with than if there's no walls at all and there's just a blank space and you just walk this way and the Mordekaiser just keeps walking directly at you, right? And so you actually have some agency as the person getting ulted, depending on where you are on the map. Like let's suppose that here, let me use like red so that it's a different color. But let's suppose that there's like a giant wall here or something, right? Look at the positioning of this Lee Sin. If the Lee Sin is actually here instead, he's actually created a much worse situation for himself because there's less room to work with going this direction or this direction, right? Whereas if the Lee Sin is like, say, over here, the Lee Sin has a bunch of a bunch of space to work with moving around the wall in this way, right? And apologies for anyone who's listening audio only. Essentially, what I'm getting at here is that depending upon your positioning and what is behind you, you can set yourself up in a position where you have a lot more space to work with, and you have a lot more options, right? Like, as an example, if you're a champion who has a dash or a blink and you just stand with your back against a wall that you can go over, or Mordekaiser doesn't have flash, or any combination of these things, right? You can create a situation where the Mordekaiser just can't follow you, right? And you just can't die to him because you dash over a wall or you blink over a wall or whatever, right? And so I think there's a lot of both. Like I think most of the counterplay to Mordekaiser Ultimate is strategic, but there is some tactical counterplay, right? Like figuring out where you want to be standing. And yes, there are going to be cases where, especially when you get hit by Mordekaiser's E, a lot of this stuff I'm saying doesn't really matter because you're just going to get pulled in, and then Mordekaiser will have full agency to kind of ult while he's on top of you, and then a lot of this stuff doesn't apply. But then that's like, well, you got hit by Mordekaiser's E. I think it's fine that his ultimate is really powerful and you lose access to some of the counterplay, right? I think a lot of the counterplay to Mordekaiser ult really only applies when he's just ulting you dry at max range without setup. And I think that that's fine, right? Ultimately, the reality is not everything in the game needs counterplay. And in fact, not everything in the game should have counterplay, right? You could ask, for example, like, what's the counterplay to Malzahar ultimate? And it's like, well, Malzahar is also stunning himself, right? And he's using a long cooldown to do this. Yes, it is really powerful for Malzahar to ult you. However, regardless of whether you think about whether QSS is in the game or not, right? Like let's suppose you just can't right click QSS in the shop. It's not even in the game. There's still counterplay to Malzahar ultimate, right? It's just a lot more of it is strategic rather than tactical of buying QSS. For what it's worth, I personally was a huge proponent when we made Mordekaiser. I was the main person pushing for this should be QSSable because I think we need an outlet for this in case it's too powerful. And I was also a big proponent of removing QSS, from being able to remove Mordekaiser Ultimate because I think what we found was that Mordekaiser, as a slow lumbering juggernaut, had plenty of counterplay, both from a tactical and strategic perspective. And because of that, we didn't need this additional layer of tactical counterplay for his ultimate. And I think it's correct, personally, that most of the counterplay to his ultimate ends up being either tied to the rest of Mordekaiser's kit, like whether you get hit by his E or not, or how close you are to him, or is strategic about like not being in this position or making sure that you can be traded out by your team, similar to the Malzahar ult thing, right? It's like, well, if you're in the right position that your team can just interrupt Malzahar ult isn't that good, right? And that isn't affected by whether you have QSS or not. And so ultimately, my thought process here is basically, I think there's plenty of counterplay to Mordekaiser ult. Not all of it is as easy or understandable or as straightforward as the counterplay that we have to a lot of other things in the game, like just say a skill shot, for example. But that doesn't mean that it's worse counterplay or that it's too low counterplay, right? Because there's a lot of point and click things in the game, right? Like what's the counterplay to Vi ultimate? You just get knocked up, right? Not everything needs counterplay. And in fact, it's actually pretty important that there are things in the game that don't have counterplay. And so because of that, that's Mordekaiser Ultimate, right? That's just how it is. If Marksmen can't go into other roles, why can't other champs go into bot lane? So, a few different things are going on here, right? I think number one is this question is kind of trying to draw a false equivalence between these two. They're not the same. And number two, I don't think really either of these, the premise behind either of these questions is correct. So let's split this into two and then sort of talk about each part, and then we can talk, I guess, a little bit at the end about the combination. So first of all, it's not the case that Marksmen can't go into other roles, right? I think we have no problem with some of the things that have cropped up in the past, right? Things like Kai'Sa jungle that was viable at one point, or things like Ezreal mid that have been quite powerful at different points, right? Not AP Ezreal mid, just AD Ezreal mid, right? But there's a difference between this champion is viable in this role because something that they're doing is particularly good right now in the game. And this class as a whole is taking over this role because they have certain properties that make them better than the default thing that you could otherwise be doing there, right? I think the 80, the recent, the when we added Absorb Life to the game and 80 carry mids became very powerful and very popular in higher MMRs, that's a really good example where what actually ended up happening there was not, oh wow, this new thing is viable. It's actually this new thing is just the default thing you should be doing, right? Like this is just the correct thing to do because against most matchups, right, against most mages, AD carries had enough sustain to just tank through their mana pool, out sustain them, out shove them, and just get an generate a small advantage and be able to neutralize mages by out sustaining their mana pool, and against the melees, and especially assassins, but just generally most of the melees, the AD carries were actually just able to scrap with them really effectively early on because of the durability patch. They couldn't they often couldn't be one shot by the melees, and then they could take a trade at, get a big chunk on the melee and then use the sustain from things like fleet or absorb life or both, and Doran's blade to sustain back up and make it so that they could actually not die to the assassins. They'd often get advantage against the melees in mid lane, and so because AD carries both outscale and were effective at neutralizing or winning lane against most matchups, right? I'm not saying this is true in literally every case. I'm generalizing here, right? But the general expectation at that time for playing an AD carry mid was that you would be able to either neutralize or win most matchups by default, and you would outscale your opponent, right? And that's not a sustainable paradigm, right? Because that just means that AD carries are the default thing that you should be playing, right? If you are winning or neutralizing by default and you outscale as a class, that just means that's the thing to play in that role, right? Unless that means that your team comp is like non-functional, which is obviously not the case for mid lane, right? And so essentially what I'm getting at here is that as a holistic class, when AD carries move into other roles, what we've historically found is that what that means is because AD carries as a class actually scale better than the other classes, right? They have more multipliers on their items, right? Especially crit AD carries, but even the non-crit builds, right? Like, for example, what was being done in mid lane, right? A lot of those AD carries, with absorbed life or, going items like Bork, etc. But even without the, being, building crit in the early slots or building crit at all, AD carries still outscale the average champion in other classes in 5v5s. And so when the game is heavily about playing for 5v5s, that kind of naturally means that AD carries we have to be pretty careful about where as a class the AD carries can go, because it'll pretty quickly become optimal to play AD carries in whatever role gives them the freest ride to their powerful scaling, right? And when that was mid lane, that was wrong, right? Because that meant that whenever you were playing mid lane, you could think about like, oh, do I want to play a mage? Do I want to play a melee? Actually, no, you shouldn't think about any of those things. By default, you should be picking an AD carry, right? And so because they supplanted the sort of default optimal choice in the mid lane, that was a huge part of why we felt we had to remove that and why that was inappropriate. This is not to say that we can't have AD carries be viable in other roles. I think it's totally fine if they are in a way that has appropriate trade-offs, in a way that is not just the default best thing that you can be doing in that role. Essentially, is how I would put this, right? And so, again, using examples like there have been times when Kai'Sa was a viable jungler, and that was totally fine. There have been times when Ezreal, playing him AD, not AP, has been a good mid laner, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Ezreal, I think, is a particularly good example because he has bad wave clear, especially prior to level 6, and he doesn't scale as well as most other AD carries because he's an AD caster that doesn't have index into crit, and so when Ezreal is viable mid, he has some pretty clear weaknesses and some pretty clear downsides over picking other things that you could play in that role. And he could be powerful there, but he's clearly not going to be the default thing that you can pick, which is a good example of like when Absorb Life was really powerful. Not like people were not playing Ezreal mid, right? It was things like Smolder and Lucian, and Tristana mid, right? The champions that could actually leverage that very powerful paradigm of like, I'm going to neutralize slash get advantages in the laning phase and then also outscale. Ezreal is not a particularly good champion for taking advantage of that, right? Whereas those other champions are, right? And anyway, we don't need to get into the weeds on that, into the details on that. Like I said, I've actually talked about this a little bit in a previous Q&A, so whatever number that is, you can go look on my Discord. There's a list of questions you can actually control F. So if you want to take a look at the previous answer I gave that, talked about range AD carry mid laners, you can hear about that in a previous Q&A. But it's not like to be clear, it's not that AD carries or marksmen cannot go into other roles. It's just that they need to have appropriate strength weakness profiles when they're doing so. And some of the examples we have of AD carries going into other roles or marksmen going to other roles did not have an appropriate strength and weakness profile, right? As for other champs going into bot lane, this one I think is particularly funny to me because other champions can go in bot lane, right? There's been many cases where things like Yasuo bot lane Yasuo bot lane was very powerful for years. I don't know what the current state of Yasuo bot on live is, but it's probably pretty good, literally right now. There are a number of like melee bot laners, as an example, that have been quite good in the past, and may even be good on live right now, right? Like off the top of my head, some of the things that I've seen are like, what about Aurelia bot lane carry, right? What about Darius bot lane carry, right? Um, and there's a number of mages that can go in bot lane and are quite powerful. And ultimately, one of the answers here is like, uh, the answer to the second part of the question is just like, yeah, other champs can go in bot lane, and most AD carry players don't want to play them, and that's fine, right? I think it's totally okay if there are other viable bot lane champions that just not that many people play. And I think one of the important distinctions here to make is like when you play a non-AD, AD carry in bot lane, you're usually giving up something pretty extreme, right? When you play a mage there, your team will actually often have a harder time winning 5v5s unless you have a really reliable, especially range source of physical damage elsewhere, right? Mage bot lanes are most optimally played with a kindred or a graves or some other meaningful sources of physical sustained damage from some other area in the game, right? Whether that's mid lane, top lane, jungle, who cares, right? That doesn't matter. But a lot of the melee bot laners, again, have a similar issue where it's like, well, you can play Aurelia bot lane and it can be powerful, but it has some costs on your composition, right? And that's part of why those things can actually be pretty powerful, and we don't have to worry about them, taking over the game or becoming the default thing, because not playing an AD carry bot lane means you're giving up on a lot of powerful scaling that you could have otherwise had, right? Ultimately, hopefully you can't hear my stomach growling. I'm probably gonna pause and go get something to eat after this one. Anyway, uh, but ultimately, my perspective on this is other champions literally can go bot lane. Just because they're not popular doesn't mean that they aren't viable. And that's okay if there are other viable bot lane champions that are good, but not necessarily something that most AD carry players want to play. I think there's also some contention around like, hey, the mages can be pretty frustrating in the 2v2, right? They can be really effective at neutralizing lanes. And we have done a patch before to try and make more classes viable in bot lane. And I think largely that did not go over super well with a lot of the AD carry player base. And so we haven't like tried to overly, encourage like, hey, here are a bunch of, you know, changes that make more champions viable in bot lanes. Like, doesn't seem like that's crazy valuable for the actual core AD carry, bot lane carry player base who mostly just want to play AD carries. But I think the current state that we have, where there are a bunch of viable mages in bot lane that are powerful. There are a number of melees that pop up from time to time that are viable, even if they're a little bit weird and they make your team composition hard to work with, that are good. I think that's totally fine, right? And again, I don't know, literally on live right now, is Aurelia bot lane good? I don't know. It's been good in the past. I don't know if it's good right now. There's a number of like bot lane carries that have been good as melees before. Might not be any literally in the current moment. That's not important to me right now. But yeah, ultimately, to answer this question sort of holistically, marksmen can go in other roles if they have appropriate trade-offs for doing so, and they're not just the best default thing to pick. And other champs can go in bot lane, but we haven't intentionally tried to like support these super heavily since 8.11. It's a few years ago, let's say, which was a patch where we did intentionally try to get more champions to be viable as bot carries to try and expand the roster of playable champions for AD carries. And generally what we found was that most AD carry players didn't value that very much. And so we haven't really heavily pursued that, right? Because most AD carry players just don't care that much about how many different options they have. They just want to play AD carries, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, right? And so that's where we're at here. Mbessa R, feeling worse after the nerf. So for those of you not keeping super close track of the patch notes, Mbessa R, the timer on it was reduced. I forget whether it was 0.5 or 0.55 seconds delay, but it's 0.7 now, I believe is the current number. And this is something that we did knowing that it would have a feels cost for Mbessa players, but the people working on this change felt like it was important that Mbessa had some limitations at longer range and had lower reliability at longer range and required either a particular positional setup, like someone is up against a wall and therefore can't dodge the R, or like an ally's CC, in order to have higher reliability on the R. Uh, this is something where I think there were a lot of things that were proposed as like, oh, we could give this back to Mbessa and it would be huge for her feels, things like early game Q cooldown, or like that was the main one that I heard discussed. We decided not to go down those roads for a number of different reasons and just give her, I think, some healing, which was also something that I think people thought would be nice. I don't have a personal take on whether the increased, the changes that we did afterwards as compensation were the right compensation for that change. But the perspective of the people, like including LivePod, that were working on the Mbessa R nerf was, hey, long term this is important for counterplay that she doesn't have like a very powerful snap engage at long range, because she is one of the most powerful champions at close range in terms of like persistent mobility, right? And dealing very high damage while being persistently mobile. And so for kit shape, they believed it was important that she had this counterplay. Now, whether we could give something back in some area that would feel good for Mbessa, yeah, maybe we could, right? Like maybe there's a way we could shift some stuff around the kit. Maybe we could give her some more damage, right? Like as an example, one of the things that I thought is like, I personally think the ult should probably do more damage in this current world, where like I feel like hitting it should be more rewarding. Like I don't necessarily think we would want to buff the CC, but I think the damage could actually just be higher in the current world, where it's like, well, you had to jump through additional hoops to hit this thing. It should probably help you kill them more easily, right? Like it's that seems like it might be appropriate, and maybe that's a good way of overcoming some of the feels loss of maybe it should feel like you get really paid out for hitting it. I don't know if that's true, right? This is another question where I personally don't have super strong opinions on the topic. Wasn't involved with the Mbessa R change in any way, and so I would recommend, if you're looking for like sort of a more deep and nuanced opinion on this, maybe take a look and see if you can find Yellow around. Right, he did make Mbessa, and so I'm sure he has some thoughts there. But yeah, my personal thought is, I don't know whether we gave the right compensation for this. Right, it obviously was a real amount of power that was taken away, but and I don't have a super strong opinion on like, hey, was this the right place to add, so an additional bit of counterplay to Mbessa's kit, right? Because I do think that it made sense. Like, I do think that Mbessa was probably a little bit below the bar in terms of offering windows of opportunity and counterplay to her, in the moment, right? Like tactical counterplay to her. And so I think adding some time to her ultimate, because that's her, one long range tool, that's a reasonable way of going about it. But was there a better way? Maybe. I don't know, right? I haven't really super deeply thought about it. And I think there's also the question of, did Mbessa get the right compensation? Like, did we want to compensate somewhere else that would feel really good for Mbessa players, but wouldn't necessarily reduce counterplay or like open up new ways in which Mbessa is like closing windows of counterplay? I don't know, right? And so generally speaking, I empathize with the pain here, right? We know whenever we change one of these like tight timing things, especially when it's to make it worse, there's going to be a lot of relearning, and that can be really painful for players, which is why we very rarely do these things. But in this particular case, we felt like it was worth it, and I can see, I think from a design perspective, I can absolutely see the argument of, hey, Mbessa, was just lacking in some of the correct tactical counterplay to her, and therefore should have a little bit more time on the ultimate. It's also the case that it might be the case that, like, hey, maybe 0.7 isn't the right number. Maybe it's supposed to be 0.6. Maybe it's supposed to be 0.65. Right? I don't have a particularly strong opinion on that. Just pointing out some things here that might be worth thinking about. Is there room for Thresh to have a passive that upgrades his abilities with X number of souls, similar to Syndra? So we could make this happen if we took power from somewhere on Thresh's kit, right? He's currently powerful, right? Like most champions. He's currently, balanced on live, or I think he's currently tuned to be on the stronger side. So we could shift power around in his kit to make this happen, right? My question with things like this is always, is it the right thing to do? And I think for Thresh, the answer to me is like, I really don't think that it is, right? Thresh, to me, part of the value of Thresh is that, like, part of the beauty of Thresh's design is that individually, every single spell that he has, every single part of his kit is actually very simple and straightforward. And when combined, they lend themselves to this really, really, really complex and interesting decision making that you make in fights, right? And I think it's a very strong value for Thresh that every single individual thing on his kit is very, very easy to understand exactly what it's doing. You pick up souls, they give you armor. Also AP, I guess, right? But that's not that important, right? Your Q is a hook with a wind up, and you get to pull them while you're doing it. Oh, you can reactivate it to travel to them, right? It's like, all pretty straightforward stuff. Your W, you throw it, it shields, and they can click it to dash to you. Your E, you can use this towards them. You can use this away. It's just a low cooldown, slow that slightly moves people. Your R, it's a box. It slows them a lot when they hit a wall. It breaks the wall, right? And then you start getting into like, oh, you hook them into the box, you flay them into the box, you lantern people, out while you're taking your Q, right? You have all these different combinations of your spells that are like permutations that are really really interesting and compelling. Um, and that's where a lot of the sort of like beauty of the design and the complexity in Thresh lies, is in the combination, like the way that he can use his spells together. And I think that generally speaking, I don't want Thresh to be thinking a lot about his passive, right? When people are playing Thresh, I want them to be generally just positive on collecting souls and having a good time with that. And not thinking about, I need to hit my 50 soul breakpoint in order to get this new effect that's going to transform my gameplay in some way, right? I just don't want to put Thresh's mind share into thinking about hitting a specific number of souls, is my concern here with this kind of mechanic. None of this is to say that we couldn't do stuff like this, right? It's like power wise, of course we could find places to nerf Thresh's kit and, give him the power, or even like take things away, right? Like as an example, we could say Thresh can't reactivate his Q until you have 25 souls. I don't think that's a good idea, but like we could absolutely do that if we wanted to. And so in general, I like, my perspective on this is that when we put breakpoints on someone's stacks, we're creating a whole mini game that they need to be thinking about and playing around, or at least they should be thinking about and playing around. And I don't want that to be the thing that Thresh players are thinking about and playing around. What I want them to be thinking about and playing around is whether they can hit this hook, what cool crazy play they can make, where they should throw their lantern, when they should cast the box, right? Like where they should be predicting their opponents and throwing their Q, right? Like a lot of this just comes down to, I don't think this is the right mechanic for Thresh. More so than that he could not have it. And so that's kind of my summary on this, is he could, but I don't think it's the right thing for him. Melee support item homogenization. So this was referring specifically to the fact that a lot of our melee support items have trended towards the same build path, which is Kindle Gem, Cloth Armor, Null Magic. This is something where ultimately the reason for this is that what we found is that there's a lot of really interesting and deep and rich decision making for tanks that have income about what resistance they're going to buy in each slot, right? Like as a top laner, it's really interesting that you have access to a set of armor items, a set of MR items, and some health, again, even some pure health items. And you get to choose in every single slot what you're going to buy based on like your game state, the game state of the enemies, etc. Right? There's a lot of interesting decision making there. And part of that is that you have a lot of gold to work with, or you have a fair amount of gold to work with, and the expectation is that you will get to, in most games, at least 2 items, often 3 items before the game is over, right? And so thinking about your full build actually like is or like your later build is actually something that's real and relevant, right? With tank supports, what we found is that they're so pushed to need to be functional on one item, and the decision making around that item actually isn't that interesting when we put like meaningfully different stats and like resistances on those items, right? Now, maybe this is less true in the current season where we've given supports more gold, right? We haven't really retested this hypothesis after the gold gain increases for supports in season 16. Maybe it's a little different now, though I suspect that that's probably not true. But the reality is we've tested other build paths for supports, right? You look at things like Trailblazer that existed in the past. You look at things like my original Zeeks that I made for season 14, and what we found, and Abyssal Mask is another good example of this. Like what we've historically found is that tank supports must be like functional in skirmishes and larger scale fights on one item's worth of stats, which means they kind of need either pure HP or hybrid resistances. And we're fine with that because we don't care that much if they have that interesting deep decision making around the stats on their items in the same way that income tanks have. If you're playing like a Malphite top or a Sejuani jungle or whatever, right? Because the effects on their items are actually more compelling, more interesting, and variable from game to game, right? Like, oh, this game I really want Locket because we're against Karthus, or this game I really want Vandal Pipes because we have Kale top and I don't know, Jarvan jungle and Vayne 80 carry or whatever. We have a bunch of champions that care about attack speed, right? And so on and so forth, right? And So essentially, what I'm getting at here is that uh, we don't need the same level of interest in the stats for tank supports because the effects are actually a lot sharper. Like the unique effects, especially in the early slot, like the first slot, are a lot sharper than they are for the income tanks. And simultaneously, the support tanks are expected to be functional in larger scale fights earlier with less stats, and that puts a pretty heavy burden on what those stats can be. Now, granted, again, like I said, we could maybe retest this hypothesis in a world where supports get a little bit more gold. Maybe it would be good for us to have a pure HP armor uh, support tank item. Maybe that could be good, where then we allow them to buy like a locket or a bandle pipes or whatever second, and that covers their needs of their MR, and that's just good enough. Maybe that's good, right? Uh, but we've tried that in the past, and it has generally not worked, right? Like that stat incentive has been felt like, oh, this item actually just doesn't work because without MR, I struggle to to play in these skirmishes or these team fights or whatever, right? Um, the pure health stuff is also interesting, right? I will note that pure health also is pretty clearly a viable option for support tanks, right? We've had in the past, there's the movement speed version of Warmogs on live. There's Protoplasm. Even before the movement speed Warmogs, there was Anathemas, which was a viable support purchase on a lot of patches, and so pure HP also works. And so maybe the answer here is like, well, we should have a spread of pure HP support tank options and hybrid resistance pure tank options, and then we should maybe even differentiate those further. Like as an example, Bandle Pipes has a little bit lower on the resistances and a little bit higher on the haste. Maybe we should push that difference more, and the difference doesn't have to be defensive in the same way that uh, income tank itemization is defensively like differentiated. But in general, I will say that like for most tank support players, they don't really care about the exact distribution of stats in their item. I'm sorry if you heard that Windows system notification. I have no idea what that was for. Probably something completely useless. Anyway, uh, but ultimately, we just don't value that decision making around the stats on the items being different for melee supports because we have other interesting things for them to build around. Basically, is our perspective is like, yeah, the items that you have access to have these really sharp, unique effects that are a bit transformative in the way that you play in ways that the income tanks aren't necessarily as much. And so the income tanks need that resistance skewing in order to make their builds appropriately, like the appropriate level of depth and interest. And also, I think we just generally don't believe that melee supports need this exactly the same level of depth and interest in their items that income tanks do. And so them having some similar stat spreads on their items is not something we consider to be like a an issue, or something that it's not saying that we couldn't improve it, right? I do think it could be better, but we don't consider this to be like a critical error or flaw of the system that we must solve, is how I would put it. Why are legacy classes still the only classes represented anywhere, and why are both the new and legacy class system kind of weird with some of their classifications? The short answer to this, is like the compressed one, is basically like we haven't really found the class system to be particularly useful, and players don't seem to have found a particularly great set of use cases for it either. But let me talk a little bit more at length around this. My understanding, and a lot of this is before my time, so some of this could be wrong, could be off base. But my understanding, generally speaking, is that the class system originally, like putting it in the client and like having a way of sort of classifying champions, a lot of that was intended to give players like a useful way of sort of categorizing and grouping champions, generally speaking, and especially newer players, being giving newer players a way for them to categorize, and especially if a newer player liked a champion, giving them a way to understand like what champions are going to be sort of like them that they might also enjoy. One of the things you might note about the newer champion spotlights is that instead of saying this champion is an X class and therefore you might like that class, we actually just name specific champions, which I think works a lot better, right? That's something that I think has been discovered to work a lot better, to just say instead of this champion is this class, they're a artillery mage, or they're a juggernaut, or they're a skirmisher, or whatever, right? Instead of saying that and then kind of expecting players to sort of like the newer players to sort of do the legwork on their own of figuring out what that even means, we say, hey, if you like Zed or Yasuo, you also might like this other new champion, right? Or, et cetera, right? And I think we found that to be effective. And I honestly think we should have, I think it would be nice if we had a form of that in the client. because that's something that's it's a I say a more recent like a more recent development over of the last like several years. Some of the testing that we've done on newer players has or like some of the research that we've done has sort of revealed that that works a lot better for them. Just like telling them these are the champions instead of this is the class or like this is the grouping, because it sort of leaves a lot like for the newer players there's sort of a lot of interpretation and like extra steps that need to be done to get them to understanding, oh, I might like this other thing as well, right? Whereas if we just tell them, hey, you like Zed, therefore you might like this other champion, that's a lot, there's a much more direct connection there, and that works better for newer players. And so that's one thing. Um, Another thing is that I think originally the classification system was intended to be a really good shorthand for players to use around like, oh, this champion is X, therefore that's why they can do, A, B, C, but they can't do, D, E, F, right? However, what we found is that not only do we just have a lot of champions that are just weirdos, right? Like that just are outlier champions that just do weird stuff. You think of like Ivern and Bard and stuff like that, right? But even beyond just like the actual outlier weirdos, we have a lot of champion kits that just do weird stuff, right? Like Jin is a great example. It's like Jin really is a mage, right? Like if we were really being honest about the classification, he would just be a mage. But players read him as an AD carry because he auto attacks and he builds crit items, right? Even though actually in terms of output in the game, he is a cooldown gated long range character who can't meaningfully scale the frequency of his damage and has a lot of like high variance damage in his kit and CC setup. Yeah, that's a mage, right? Like I'm literally describing what makes a mage a mage. And so uh there's a like there are a lot of things that ended up like it wasn't just we have a few edge cases that are weird with this system. It was a huge percentage of our champions are edge cases in these classification systems, and therefore using them as shorthand to talk about these things still can be useful, right? But it's a lot less useful, I think, or a lot less relevant, I think, to use the classification systems to talk about like this champion is a juggernaut and that like what that means for them, and like this champion is a skirmisher and that means these other different things for them. That ended up being a lot less useful than I think was originally intended or was originally thought would be. Great example of this is like juggernauts, where it's like the literal definition of juggernauts is that you're a low to like zero mobility champion who has death touch. Like you can kill anything given time, and you have to pass some kind of gameplay check in order to kill people. And it's like, yeah, but what about Urgot and Set? They actually have dashes. Now they might not be the best dashes, and Set's is on his ultimate, of course, right? But they do actually have mobility, right? And that doesn't mean that they're not juggernauts, right? It just means that the definition of juggernaut is kind of blurry, right? And that's kind of where we ended up with the class systems, both the new and the old one. And that's kind of why I think we don't really lean super heavily on that in the modern day, is that we found that they are mostly just useful for like quick, like low stakes conversations, but not particularly good for, oh, what does that actually mean for champions or champion design or the structure of a champion? Not much, right? Because actually it turns out that we can just make trade-offs in other areas, right? It's like Urgot and Set are less inevitable than Darius and Garen and Alawi, right? And that's why they're allowed to be more mobile than them. These things are not black and white, right? They are often some, sliding scale shades of, well, we can give them a little bit more mobility if they give up on this other strength, right? And so on and so forth, right? That applies to pretty much every class's like strengths and weakness definition, right? Because these definitions are not set in stone and sharply black and white, the classification system is mostly just a tool that we can use to have conversations, and not necessarily something that is a law, if that makes sense, right? Um, I don't necessarily know like the exact specifics of like why do we have the exact version of the class system that we have in the client. A lot of this just comes down to, yeah, we haven't really prioritized focusing on updating this because it's not something that is causing harm. It's not something that's doing a bad thing on live, and therefore it's like fine to exist the way that it is. Very few players actually ever look at these things anyway, and so the reality ends up just being it's not a problem, therefore we haven't prioritized fixing it. It's not causing issues, and therefore we don't really mind that much if the classification systems in the client aren't super like up to date or robust or modernized, if that makes sense. Nasus rework. So this is something that actually comes up from time to time on my stream. I don't know, probably every couple of months someone comes by and asks about this. So I thought it would be make a good topic for the Q&A videos to reference in the future. And someone did ask this in the Q&A question suggestions in my Discord, so thought I'd throw it up. But yeah, Nasus is, in my opinion, actually a really, really, really great champion as he is now. And I understand that when some people say rework, they mean very different things, right? Some people are saying, I want Nasus W to be a different spell. Some people are saying, I want Nasus E to be a different spell. Some people are saying, I want some small mechanical changes, right? In my opinion, I think we could definitely do some small mechanical changes that would be good for Nasus. As an example, I think that the shape of the champion has been made worse by the 50% Q cooldown reduction in R, right? Because that does two things that I think are not as good for Nasus, right? Number one is it makes him really powerful at level 6, where there's a lot of matchups now where Nasus just plays really passively, doesn't even care that much about how many stacks he's getting pre-level 6, and then just all ins level 6 and has a really good chance at getting a kill or forcing a base or whatever and generating an advantage off that. And I don't think that's very Nasus, right? Like how powerful that moment is. And secondarily, because it scales the frequency of the Q, that means the Q has to be a lot less powerful like in the later parts of the game. Like we have to tune the fact, like the Q around the fact that you get to Q twice as much in R, and so your bonks don't get to be as powerful, and your stacking doesn't get to be as powerful, which I think is lame for Nasus. Now, I'm not saying I'm gonna go remove it tomorrow or anything like that, but like I think that's an example of a mechanic that could be changed, right? Should it be less? Should it not be there at all, right? Could there be other things to do, right? I'm not saying I'm going to make this change, but I just do think mechanically speaking, there are spaces I look at on Nasus's kit and I say like, yeah, I think there are things we could shift around, power that we could redistribute, maybe mechanics that could be changed that could maybe result in a better version of him. But I'm actually pretty opposed to changing out Nasus's spells. I do not think Nasus needs any new spells. I think his kit actually is really good the way that it is, the way that it combines well together and nicely with each other. Right, like the combination of his W and his E, for example, the way that his R gives him durability, and all these things together, and of course the core loop of his Q and his passive in the lane of like I want to get more stacks, like, and that gives me, more value out of my lifesteal passive, and I'm trying to out sustain my opponent. I think all of those things are great, right? And it's not to say that any of those things, don't have rough edges or couldn't be improved here and there. But I don't think Nasus is in need of a new spell or like an actual like true rework or anything of the kind, right? Because Nasus works for the people that want to play him. And one of the weird things is some people come to me and they say like, I want a Nasus rework because Nasus, needs more mobility and like I want to play him. And I'm like I'm a Fiora player or whatever. It's like well, Nasus isn't for Fiora players, right? Like Nasus is for people who want to have this really, really sharp stacking, scaling, slow juggernaut experience, right? That is what he is for. And I think he actually serves that audience very well right now, right? There's good reasons why he's actually a fairly popular champion. And if you are someone who plays in higher MMRs, you might not know that because his popularity falls off quite sharply as you go up in MMRs. But for most players, he's actually a fairly popular top laner and pretty much always is a fairly reasonably popular top laner. And in general, by the way, this is just a not super relevant to Nasus, but just in general, by the way, if you're someone who is like high skill and you're saying like, oh, I never see Juggernauts in top lane, Juggernauts in general are just much more popular in lower MMR. And you see champions like Mordekaiser and Darius and Garen, etc., like just much more frequently in lower MMRs. And so that's something where like I definitely see when I'm talking on like my stream and having a dialogue with people, a lot of people get tripped up by that of like, oh, we should improve these juggernauts. They should be reworked. It's like, no, they're actually working really well for their audience. And it's okay that higher MMR players want to play more of, the Rivens, the Fioras, the Aatroxes, right? Like the more like the heavier skill skew champions. That's totally okay, right? That different types of players have different desires. But Nasus works really well for his audience, as do most of the juggernauts, I would say, right? Work really well for their audiences. And I do not think that Nasus is anywhere close to being in need of a rework or a new spell or anything of that kind, right? And to me, I think it's actually even good, right? Like some people come and they say, I want Nasus to have a rework because I don't like getting withered. I think Wither is a good spell for League to exist. I think it's actually pretty good for us to have a certain level of powerful point and click effects that don't have tactical variants, like kind of what I was talking about around the Mordekaiser stuff earlier around like Mordekaiser arts. Like it's good for there to be some effects that are primarily strategic in nature, and the counterplay is not in the moment-to-moment gameplay of like dodging a skill shot. I think it's good for there to be a lot of tactical counterplay in League, but it's also important for the game to function the way that it's supposed to function, that not everything has in the moment counterplay, right? Sometimes you just get auto attacked for a bunch of damage, right? In much the same way that if you're a crit 80 carry and you can auto attack someone to death, and there's not really much they can do about it if they're in range of you, Nasus can wither you and you get withered, right? Like that's all you can do, right? And so to me, I do not think Nasus is even remotely close in needing in need of a rework. But I do think that there are opportunities for improvements on the kit in terms of like shape and power curve and like some of the the individual mechanics on all of his spells, right? It's like none of this is to say that he has exactly the right distribution of like numbers or mechanics exactly throughout his kit, right? But what I am getting at is that I do think that he's great the way that he is, on the whole. Should multi-AA empowering abilities benefit from Sheen on all those attacks such as Set/Skarner Q? Easy answer to this is no. I do not think this should work like this. However, I do think it would be totally reasonable for there to be a Sheen item for those kinds of champions where we could say have a Sheen effect that has 2 stacks or 3 stacks or whatever. I think if that was a unique thing that a Sheen item did, that would be totally okay. However, I do not think that we want to get ourselves into an area where any effect that empowers multiple attacks now has to be tuned around the fact that it applies Sheen multiple times. It's really important for Sheen that it is very simple input-output pair. Press a button, cast a spell, click the enemy, you get a damage, right? That's all you have to worry about. You don't have to think about your sequencing, really. You don't have to worry about anything else other than you press the button and you attack them, right? That's it. That's all there is to it. A good example of why this might be problematic is like Fiora, right? Like if we made an exception for empowered ability, like empowering abilities, Fiora now has to worry about whether her Sheen is on or off cooldown when she uses her E, right? It's now, oh man, I really am not supposed to instantly E someone after I Q them because my Q consumes my Sheen, and now I need to wait for my 1.5 second Sheen cooldown before I can E, right? Similarly with like Set, for example, this creates a really bizarre sequencing concern of, oh, I E'd someone to get them to me. Now I have to make a decision. Do I want to auto attack, use the Sheen proc from my E, and then wait 1.5 seconds before I Q, or should I Q instantly to get extra value out of that Sheen proc? Basically, we're creating really, really complicated sequencing demands, which is not something that Sheen should have, right? If we were to do this just to Sheen itself. And in general, I don't think that like empowering all attacks from an empowered sequence is generally likely to be particularly compelling as a design. I do, however, think that there is probably space for a Sheen that applies for multiple attacks. That's something that I've actually prototyped before that I think could be really cool. And you can see I've prototyped a lot of Sheen items because I've actually, put multiple of them in the game, right? You can look at Essence Reaver and Dusk and Dawn. But I think there is some potential here, though we do have a lot of Sheen items these days, so I don't know if we really need more of them. But I think there is some potential that there could be something cool with Sheen that is applied over multiple attacks or has a bit more gameplay to it. But I wouldn't want that gameplay to be you really need to concern yourself with when your Sheen is on or off cooldown and the sequencing of your spells exactly with when your Sheen is applied. Because that's not what Sheen is about. Sheen is supposed to be a simple and straightforward pattern that just says, press a button, get an output, and you don't really have to worry that much about the cooldown. That's pretty important for Sheen. And so because of that, I think the answer to this question is pretty cleanly no. We shouldn't make this change exactly because it has immense sequencing concerns. And we'd also then have to tune a lot of these spells, right? Something like Skarner Q, then basically it probably can't scale much damage at all because it's going to be carrying essentially the damage value of 2 extra Sheen procs every single time you use it, which really doesn't seem very desirable to me, that we would then have to tune any multi-AA empowering spells around having such a crazy level of synergy with Sheen, right? That seems kind of dubious to me. Just generally from a tuning perspective. And so yeah, I think that this is one where I can pretty cleanly say, like, I don't think in our current structure that this makes a whole lot of sense, but I think something that gets at the sort of soul of this, of like the sort of heart of I want to be able to empower multiple AAs after I Sheen, that I think could be really cool. Like I think there is something like some potential in that space. And like I said, I've prototyped it before, but haven't found anything that I thought was particularly great in that area. Anyway, thanks for watching. This is going to be the end of number 27. And yeah, let me know how you feel about the dark mode. Let me know how you feel about the MS Paint. And yeah, apologies for anyone who is just listening to this audio only and not seeing it. Hopefully, I gave you a decent description of what was going on with Mordekaiser. But yeah, thanks for watching and catch you next time.